Hi everyone, it's Ken Kim. Hope everyone's doing well. Just wanted to go over today about Islam, just not necessarily anything about the religion, but more or less just from an analytical standpoint on how it's becoming a more prevalent religion across the world, and just going over some of the different stats and why it looks promising for them for the future. So this first map we see here is pretty much the fertility rates across the world. As you can see here, if you're in the blue, it means you're below the 2.1 replacement rate. And as you can see on the map, more than half of the world countries are below this replacement rate. So the 2.1 replacement rate in this regard is you need one child to replace a mom and one child to replace a dad, with the additional zero point 0.1 to help increase the population and account for things like premature deaths and other variables and factors. And so as we can see here, the only countries that are above the 2.1 replacement rate or birth rate are the countries in Africa and the Middle East where Islam is the predominant religion. And the countries that are usually below this birth rate, eventually, if they have the birth rates too low for an extended period of time, they're more likely to embrace immigration. And you're starting to see that in parts of like Europe, even the US, and some of these other countries, and it is shifting their dynamics. And as you can see here, according to the World Bank and United Nations, the high fertility rates, you see the actual raw numbers here. A lot of African nations have very, very good birth rates, but then also too, you have countries like Afghanistan where they're more than double the birth replacement rate right now. So like the fact that they're having averages of like almost 5 in Afghanistan, that's pretty incredible considering that means there's a lot of families that have much more kids than that. Meanwhile, when you look at the other regions of the world, for example, on the left I have North and South America and also Central America. You see that a lot of countries there are in the ones, the in the low replacement rate. And the middle column here, we have a bunch of countries in Europe, the different regions like the UK, and then also to other countries in Western and Eastern Europe. And on the right here, we do have Australia and Southeast Asia, but then also too, we have some countries in Asia like Korea, Japan, and China. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Korea and Japan just because I am ethnically Korean, and just wanted to just go over how they are probably going to have to approach this birth rate given the trends. And I also want to go over a map from a geopolitical standpoint, just because this is just a map of countries that condemn Russia and countries that are actually supporting Russia, considering the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict right now. We see here a lot of the countries that have the higher fertility rates tend to have better opinions on Russia, while the countries that are sympathetic towards Ukraine, a lot of them are actually the ones that are losing population right now. So that is something to keep in mind, that the dynamic could change on perception on Russia Ukraine, but also to a lot of the countries with the higher fertility rates, birth rates, also tend to have a very favorable view of China. And now I'm just going to compare the different world religion percentages. I just had Christianity, Islam, and Judaism just because those are some of the more practiced religions a few hundred years ago. I mean, we do have Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and all these other religions, but for right now, the reason why I want to go over Christianity in particular is because Christianity, even in the year 1900, was the most practiced religion. It was at 34.5%, and then Islam was only at 12.3%. So to give you an idea on raw numbers, total population in 1900 was only 1.6 billion. The total population in 2000 was about 6.0 billion, which makes sense just because there's been a lot of growth over essentially the last century and a half. And you see in the year 2000, in just one century, Islam had shot up another 7%, while Christianity just went down slightly by 1%. And so the reason I'm showing these numbers, and other research firms also have similar numbers in that regard, is because you look at Pew Research and the recent numbers now in 2010, 2020, Islam has almost completely closed the gap on Christianity, and it's growing at a faster rate because of the higher birth rates. But so, along with non-religious, are also starting to grow at a higher rate than Christians. Religious experts from the year 1900 would probably be in shock that Islam in the 21st century has almost completely closed the gap on Christianity, just because during in the year 1900, there was a pretty substantial difference. In the coming decades, that is expected to change with the birth rates in the different regions and the retention as well. That Islam most likely is going to overtake Christianity on a global perspective. And you can see at the bottom here that Christianity, the percentage continues going down from 30.6 to 28.8%, while Islam continues to grow up. So there's only a 3% difference now between Christianity and Islam as of 2020, and then I can imagine the percentage is even a little bit better now, just because Islam continues to have a much higher birth rate than any other of the regions in that regard. And so we see here that Muslims are projected to be the fastest growing religious group. They're growing at a much higher exponential rate on a global perception. And in each region of the world, Islam has a younger median age than the non-Muslims. So what that means is, as the older generation dies off, the lack of children from the millennial and Gen Z generation will contribute to changing demographics that are going to become more noticeable, and the Muslim percentage will become weighted much higher. And you see here on the right, we see that Islam is actually having one of the better retention rates. Now, granted, that could be debatable just because some of these Islamic countries, you're not allowed to leave Islam, so that could skew the data as well. But we see on the left here, the religion that we see most people have the religious disaffiliation where people are leaving and converting to atheism or agnostic is Christianity. And we also do have examples of religious switching. For example, 11% of Kenyan Muslims were actually identifying as former Christians or non-religious. However, the good thing for Christianity is deconversion from Christianity has slowed the last few years, but birth rates, like in the recent CDC report that just got released a few days ago, it's still showing declining birth rates. The US actually just got below 1.6 in terms of the birth rate just recently. And I want to talk about Japan too, because Japan was talked about as having one of the worst birth rates in the world. But recently they started to relax on immigration because they have to have a need for workers to pay into things like retirement programs, other types of government programs, well, infrastructure and other benefits. And so the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people probably are not aware, but you have universities like Waseda University, Tokyo, Japan, and other colleges as well that have discussed how in Japan, mosques were almost non-existent in the year 1999, as late as that time frame. But now in the last 2 decades, that has increased by almost 10 times the amount. And part of it has to do with the fact that they've gotten a lot more relaxed on immigration. But then also to Japan, like Korea, is near the top for life expectancy. So they need a much bigger workforce to pay into more people going on retirement as the decades come. And Japan is getting more immigration from areas with the high fertility rates. And there's already been some culture clashes because some of the people that live in Japan that are attached to the traditional Japanese culture, they are probably afraid of the dynamic and the culture change that's probably going to happen as there becomes more immigration. And that's why you're seeing probably like the furthest right section of the Japanese politics that's starting to rise a little bit as a result of that. And now I will talk about my home country, Korea. My home country, Korea, actually has the lowest birth rate in the world right now at 0.7, which is about a third of the replacement rate of 2.1. So when you do that math, for every 100 Koreans right now, that would equate to 33 to 34 kids. And then to take a third of that, that'd be about 11 to 12 grandkids replacing the prior generation. Korea could utilize things like more automation to replace the human workforce productivity, which can help in that regard. However, that doesn't address issues like real estate, where the next generation pool of buyers is too small for the existing homes, that as more and more people retire or die off, and automation robotics just buy things like homes. So they will have a need for more people to live in the country. Otherwise, they have potential to crash the real estate market, but then also do crash their economy. And this problem isn't just a problem only for Korea and Japan. It is a problem that's a concern for many countries right now because of the declining birth rates. And that's one of the reasons why I want to look at the different age groups to see if the birth rates would potentially get a little bit better. With Gen X, most of Gen X is already in their late 40s to 50s, possibly even early 60s. So the birth rate realistically is probably not going to improve that much more better for Korea in that regard. And then so I started looking at some of the OBGYN statistics just because I wanted to see like what factors barriers that the Korean women will have. So obviously you have things like early premature menopause. You have high risk of miscarriage once a woman's after the age of 30. You also have less successful IVF rates after the age of 35, especially. And I was just comparing things from CDC, the NHS from the United Kingdom, Johns Hopkins University, Yale, and a lot of other medical studies. And I am not trying to pretend like I'm an OBGYN expert, but more or less I wanted to see what the probability was for these generations to have more than 4 to 5 kids to kind of help balance out the 0.7 birth rate that Korea has right now. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that this generation is probably not going to help the birth rate either in that regard. They'll probably average most likely 2 to 3 kids if the trend doesn't continue, but realistically, it's probably not going to get much higher than that. And then I look at Gen Z. So similar to the U.S., Gen Z men are actually getting more conservative in Korea than prior generations, but Gen Z women are actually getting more liberal, and this is according to Taipei Times and other types of articles that have covered this. However, for Gen Z women in Korea in particular, there's actually a rise in feminist sentiment in, among the younger generation, which there's a movement called the 4B movement where a lot of women are refusing to have sex, have children, have marriage. And considering this type of movement, this is honestly like horrendous timing for Korea, considering their birth rate situation right now. And I try to look at it from a different perspective where maybe Korea could do something like maybe legalize cloning, which would be controversial. But even then, though, that's not gonna. I that technology is still like not tested where it could drastically improve the birth rates. So most likely Korea's gonna cave on immigration and probably have similar migration patterns and similar styles of immigrants that come into their country just like Japan. Just because it's not looking like when you look at the different age groups that the birth rate is going to get that much better anytime in the near future. And then we see here some European projections from Pew Research. Pew Research essentially has a lot of these European countries becoming Muslim majority in the coming decades, just because even if these countries right now were to do a 180 on their immigration policies, the local birth rate of a lot of these countries is much lower than the migrant birth rate. So we have a lot of big name countries that people are familiar with: the UK, France, Belgium, Bulgaria, Italy, whatnot. And now I'm going to talk about the US because we see some data from the US Census comparison of natural increase, which is more births proportional to deaths, compared to natural decrease, which is more deaths than births. In the red is natural decrease. And as we can see in this slide and the next slide, almost every region of the US is having more natural decrease than increase. We see some numbers where even though the number looks kind of high, it's still a natural decrease, and that's because it depends on the county in the sense that even if a bunch of counties have a natural increase, the other counties could have enough of a deficit to cancel it out. And so the state as a whole could have a natural decrease. But on the flip side, we do have examples, for example, like in New York, where they had a few counties in New York City that had natural increases that was able to offset the natural decrease in most of the counties in the state. So that resulted in a natural increase for the entire state, but that was actually mainly due to immigration and not birth rates. And so historically, the U.S. has always had a good birth rate, actually, of like 4 to 7 children. But since the 1970s, it's actually been below replacement rate, as you can see on this chart here. And this is part of the reason why the U.S. has started to relax a lot more on immigration, and why America went from, for the longest time, being over 85% white till like since the 1980s, it's been getting less and less widely is because they've kind of had to rely on immigration to cancel out the low birth rates they've been having since the 70s. And a lot of people are trying to speculate what may have caused this. So there's a couple of things that people have kind of speculated. Maybe it was during the 1970s because of Roe v. Wade becoming a thing. Maybe it's because more women were entering the workforce or focusing on their careers. Maybe it might have been the rise in technology. Maybe the baby boom from World War II finally started wearing off finally. Regardless, the U.S. has had to rely on more immigration just because to help keep increasing the population. And despite different economic conditions since the 1970s, the only time the replacement rate has been above water since that time period was actually during the second Bush administration during a second term. So the nice thing is, because of immigration, the population in the U.S. as a whole has not decreased because of immigration. However, immigration in the future will most likely come disproportionately from the high birth rate regions moving forward in the coming decades because of the other countries that they've had to rely on for immigration. Their birth rates are starting to decline pretty hard. And as a whole, for the U.S., Islam is on target to overtake Judaism in the next decade or so as the second most practiced religion in America. And if birth rates don't improve in the U.S., it could have a shot at overtaking Christianity in the U.S. before the end of the century. And so I just brought up this Morgan Stanley article just because they talked about the pay gap, but they also talked about how, with a lot more women focusing on their careers, they're actually forecasting that 45% of prime age working women will be single by the age of 2030, which is in 5 years right now, up from 41% in 2018. So it's just examples like this that show that most likely the birth rate is probably not going to get that much better in the US. As the CDC even mentioned, how America was at 1.6 right now, and the birth rate continues getting worse. And so now I just talk briefly about political, just because the interesting thing about the Muslim voting pattern is Muslims actually used to overwhelmingly vote for the GOP, believe it or not. But a lot of Muslims actually left the GOP after the 9/11 attacks and legislation like the Patriot Act under George W. Bush. And the reason why this trend was not noticeable is because even in 2000, the country as a whole was a lot wider than it was now in the 2020s. And Pew Research pointed out, like, among Christian Catholics and Jews, Bush improved from 2000 to 2004, but when it came to other religions, including Islam, he actually lost support with people practicing other religions. It's believed, according to some exit polls, that John Kerry won over 90% of the Muslim vote. And so you see here, from Bush 2000 to 2004, his share of not other religion voters went from 28 to 23%. Meanwhile, from Al Gore to John Kerry went from 62 to 74%. And now the last thing I want to talk about is Israel, because it's not a secret that Americans are starting to feel less sympathetic towards Israel, considering different narratives. American sympathy towards Israel has been declining actually for a while, and for the first time, according to the Gallup poll, it's at below 50%. And to be frank, Israel's support in the U.S. is already on life support with a changing demographic, and Israel is probably gonna have a hard time trying to find allies in the future, just because there's a lot of countries in the Middle East that are not the biggest fans of Israel. And I wouldn't be surprised if even countries like the US start cutting off the relationship with Israel as a result. So, in conclusion, after showing the data from the several different angles, several different regions of the world, it's reasonable to assume that the general expectation is that Christianity in the next few decades will most likely lose its title as the most practiced religion in the world to Islam. However, things could always change. Maybe a war breaks out, AI causes birth rates to decline even in those specified countries, abortion may become prevalent in those high fertility rates areas. We don't know, but regardless, from the trends perspective right now, it's starting to look very, very good for Islam on a global stage, and that's something that I think a lot more politicians are starting to kind of try to take into factor. That's, I think, one of the reasons why a lot of countries are becoming a little bit more careful with the whole Israel-Palestine conflict. And it'll be interesting to see like how politicians in the future will try to adapt their stance on that. But no, yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen to me. And yeah, hope everyone has a great day. Bye.